Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Cedric Folk, former curator of exhibitions at Nottingham Contemporary. And I'm really pleased to be joined tonight by Ulrich Macmillan, with who we are going to be in conversation for like about 45 minutes, I would say, but let's see how it goes. About some of the issues that are touched upon the exhibition Grace Before Jones, which I co-curated together with like Olivia Ahern, and which is currently still on display, but that no one can see, I guess. I'm gonna read your a bit of your bio, Yuri, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yuri is a cultural historian who researches and writes in the interstices between Black cultural studies, performance studies, queer theory, and contemporary art. His first book, Embodied Avatars, Genealogies of Black Feminist Art and Performance, 2015, is on Black performance art, objecthood, and avatars staged by Black women artists. He has published articles on performance art, digital media, hip-hop, photography, and 19th century performance cultures in varied arenas such as Women and Performance, a journal of feminist theory, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, GLQ, a journal of gay and lesbian studies, and Hemispherica. In addition, he has lectured at art museums, including MoMA PS1 and the Hammer Museum, and published numerous essays on Black contemporary art for the Studio Museum of Harlem. His work has been supported by the Ford Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. So if you just want to say hi to start with, yes. I'm really pleased actually because that we are in conversation because you were actually like very important source of thinking for me on when I was like working on the show, and actually one of your some of your writing appears in the booklet of the exhibition, which which helped me kind of problematize ideas around Blackness and Black image making, I would say. And I might, to start with, like read that very quote I'm referring to, which is like from an introduction to the Woman in Performance, a journal of feminist theory that you edited, right? Yeah. And the text was titled Introduction, Skin, Surface, Sensorium. And that's from like February 2018. It was published then. And you wrote, I quote, black skin becomes an endlessly pliable surface rather than a finite one, as we witness a body seemingly without depth, pure surface. Jones's skin resembles a reflecting metal surface. Blackness is something fluid yet dense, an ever-changing surface, and yet never simply just that. It cannot hold an identifiable shape and does not have a distinguishable inside. Sorry for the hiccups in English. And I thought that maybe that was like a good way to start by just like asking you about your relationship to Grace Jones and how she kind of echoes some of the work you've been doing, and maybe you can also like explain to give like a broad scope or a broad idea of like what you've been like working on for a few years now, how that comes into place in relation to what we're going to speak about tonight. Yeah.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I wish I was actually there to see the show in person, but the virtual rendering of it has already given me a lot to work with. Yeah, it's interesting because, I remember the last year that I was finishing my PhD, that I literally had finished my dissertation, and I was watching the Corporate Cannibal video, and I just knew that it was something that I would want to write about, but you know, it was something that kind of left in the background until, you know, I finished a book a couple of years later and got the first book out. And then when I was really thinking about, you know, what I wanted to work on next, strangely enough, you know, grace just has a way of kind of like, you know, creeping back into your life, you know? So I think for me, I started thinking about that video again. And I think maybe the space of having years between it, I finally, I guess, had the language to kind of talk about it. Um, and as I began thinking about her, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I didn't necessarily think that she was going to become such a big figure in my thinking, but I think that I'm really attracted to writing about people who are a bit misunderstood, and people who, I think particularly someone like Grace, who we all know who she is, you know, we're all familiar with the work, but she's a very hard person to write about. You know, like you really have to sit with her for a while because the work is so multivalent. And she as a figure never sits still. You know, so I think there's that aspect of her. The challenge of writing about somebody who is inherently transnational, like someone who's equally at home in Spanish Town as she is in Paris, as she is in New York. Um, and you know, somebody who I think doesn't always is not a figure who fits very easily into cultural histories, you know. So in some ways what I had to do as I started really thinking about her, I had to really, I've been like, you know, really teaching myself a lot about her trajectory. And I think what I started really realizing is that what I was writing, or what I, you know, I've been writing the past couple of years, like I've really started to think about, you could like, you know, what does a cultural history of New York City in the late 1970s look like? And if she is kind of a central figure, like who are the other central figures around her? So I started thinking about that. And I think I was also interested in thinking in particular for Jones, somebody who I think has been kind of not as celebrated as she should be, in part because I think that she can't be easily placed and say alongside, you know, Black photography, for instance, or Black image makers until really recently. I think a lot of work has come out recently about people, figures like Anthony Barboza and Ming Smith, that have really made that link much clearer than it has been. But I think, you know, I was really interested in telling a different story. You know, what is a story that we can tell about Grace Jones that goes in directions that we don't expect it to go? You know, can we talk about her outside of the context of her work with Jean Paul, for instance? Like, you know, if we did, like, what would that look like? So I think that I was interested in that. And it's funny, you know, when I tell people that I'm writing about her, you know, I've noticed that almost every time I tell somebody that everybody has a very particular memory of Grace, you know, whether it was somebody who went to a concert in the 80s or the 90s, whether it's a memory of, you know, a sibling who had a vinyl record of hers. So I just noticed that there has been a way that I don't think the scholarship has really caught up to the way that she operates in people's cultural memories. I think she has been a figure who has, I think, been really prominent in a lot of ways about the way that people think about, you know, Black image making. I think the limits of what, like, you know, how you can be a Black artist and the kind of different ways you could be a Black artist, a Black artist and performer. So yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about that. And yeah, it does. I think I've also just been really thinking about, you know, like what does Black avant-garde work look like, you know? And I think if we think about that, then there's really no way you can't talk about Grace, because I think Grace is one of the central figures of what a Black avant-garde history would look like. So I've just been thinking a lot about all of those different things with her.
It's quite interesting to hear. Actually, for me, like, I mean, it makes me think of my own kind of relationship to her, because I born in the early 90s. Is she was not someone that was kind of like as prominent as she was before, but and actually it's quite interesting because the exhibition, as we devised it, kind of stops historically around the early 90s, and the kind of like yeah, I would say like peak of the AIDS crisis, I would say. And the first kind of, when I try to kind of go back to my first memories, the first memories I have of her, I keep going back to my mother, but at the same time, she's not, when I ask her, she's like, yeah, maybe that, yeah, that person that played in like a James Bond movie. And she's not that precise, so maybe I built up something, but for sure, the when like the first time I Googled her was when there was that whole kind of like um yeah, like thing around Lady Gaga, basically, and Grace Jones like reclaiming some kind of, yeah, the legacy, or like what the influence she had on like more contemporary pop icons. And I was like very much I was very much into Lady Gaga when I was a teenager, and I was like, who is that person that is like reclaiming whatever, like the fashion, the style, and even the music. And I was kind of like, okay, that's interesting, but I only kind of came back to her much later on, and kind of started to understand, yeah, the importance she had. But then when I started to work on the show, I also one of the things that was very very important to me, and you mentioned actually, is like to not focus only on the Jean-Paul Goude imagery, basically, and see outside of that, and complexify basically the image that we can have of her. And so that was like focusing on maybe the disco era in the first place, and actually like how did she start to kind of build up the image that is maybe more imprinted into our minds now, when we speak about Grace Jones. And one of the first image we start with in the show is actually like an image of her that is so different from what we know of her, like and that is actually like we haven't been able to track down the photographer. An image that seems to, yeah, she's very young looking. Her hair is like kind of put back, but like that like seems naturally treated, and she has a choker at the same time. And I was very much kind of like interested in starting with that image that is a bit unsettling, to be honest, to then very much kind of create a contrast with the images that will come later in the show.
Well, I think what's interesting to think about with her, because this is another thing that attracted me only after I started really investigating, that, you know, I think for a lot of people, when people think of Grace Jones and modeling, they think of like a lot of the work that came out when she was in Paris. You know, a lot of those work with people like, you know, Helmut Newton, and like these really accomplished photographers. But a lot of them, I think it's almost like a prehistory, like the prehistory of the work that people are familiar with, are most familiar with. Like, people don't know, for instance, that in the beginning, like you were saying, you know, her images at the very beginning of her modeling career look very different, you know. And I think in some ways what we see is a kind of struggle in the very beginning, because, you know, I think her first modeling job was a before and after for Essence magazine. You know, and then she did a couple of different images in Essence with, you know, with Barboza.
Yeah.
But, you know, so like those are the earliest images that we have with her. But like you said, that particular, I know the image you're talking about now, like the image of her with her hair, I mean, it looks so incredibly different than the Grace that we're familiar with. Like, it almost looks like a completely different person. So I think, you know, what's interesting about that is also, you know, like we always think of Grace as the kind of androgynous figure that we have become really familiar with. But I think when you see those earlier images, we realize that, like, you know, that androgyny really did not completely come into play until much later,
Mm.
like, you know, the late 70s. And I think in particular, like when John Paul decided to kind of shave her head. But I think before that, you know, I think what's really striking about some of the images is she's much more feminine looking than people are familiar with, you know?
Yeah, definitely. There is that. There is like, as you mentioning, the way the hair is being styled is very different. I mean, in the Essence photo shoot, that is like actually Barbosa photographs, very much like anchored into the disco era, and she has a huge afro, which is like not something we used to. I mean, when was the last time she wore one? I mean, that's like
Right.
so odd, and at the same time very interesting because obviously in the history of Black image making at the time, I guess there was that the whole idea of like Black beauty, and what I was trying to also kind of show with the exhibition was how she actually did not fit the criteria of Black beauty, and how she that's something like she speaks about very openly, and how she had to kind of, because of that, create her own category, which is like a uncategory somehow, or like a non-category, I would say. But I actually like one of the image of Babo that I think relate a lot to like the those lines that I read from you, on the idea of surface and blackness and depth, and that metallic, yeah, the idea of like a metal skin, is very much like manifests a lot through that image of Anthony Barbosa, where you have like her face um, zoomed in, uh, and it's a black and white image, but somehow the texture makes it like not black and white to me. It's such a, and also because there is nothing else, it's just the face. It's just the face, with
Well,
those.
you know what was funny about that image is, you know, I was looking through the exhibition catalog from the Kamanji workshop, and then I didn't see this before, but there's literally an image of 3 or 4 of the members of the workshop in a room
Mhm.
around a table talking, and that image is just sitting on the wall. So I just thought that was really interesting because I had never seen that image before. That Going back to what you were saying, it's like, you know, it's really striking when you start to see that you could actually kind of place her within these discussions about, like, you know, like Black Power imagery, for instance, because I think there's a kind of conception that Grace is so far from that, but she's not. I mean, she's far from it in terms of the image that we know her for, is very distinct from that. But when you see the kind of trajectory, it's really interesting to think. It's like, oh yeah, like you said, like, you know, if we think in the very beginning of her modeling career, I think there was a real struggle to kind of place her within that context. And I think the fact, like you said, that the context doesn't fit for her at all, really. Um, you know, but so sometimes I think of the Barbosa, that image of the face, as one that's closer to the work that comes later.
Definitely,
Um,
yeah.
you know, I just think the way, because I think it's also closer in the sense of, like I talked about in the article, the way that, you know, Grace really plays with ideas of surface and depth, you know, and she really, I think, embraces the idea, like the negative connotations of surface as superficiality, as something that's lacking seriousness, in the way that she kind of takes on some of those connotations of surface, you know, in her other work, like whether it's performance work or visual work.
Mhm. Yeah, that's it's quite interesting to hear. It makes me think as well of how maybe that idea of, because the surface of a skin, somehow to me, one of the things that I was also like interested in showing and putting in tension was the way she could, or like photographers had accentuated her blackness somehow, or like worked with like very dark images, and which maybe actually also accentuate the androgyny, I would say, and herself sometimes playing with like white makeup, and like
Yeah.
whitening her face, looking like some kind of a doll, like a doll. But it's somehow you could say that it has the same effect. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting to me. I haven't been able to kind of fully come to terms with it. I think, but it was very interesting to me the way she felt like very. She had the license to kind of like at the same time get darker and play with that, and at the same time playing with white makeup. I don't know if you have any kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing when you look at all the images, that I agree. There is something about it, almost seems as if a lot of the images actually focused on her skin itself. Like there's almost this fascination that we see in terms of even just like the lighting, for instance.
Mm,
That, and I see this, you know, we see this across a lot of different photographers she works with. It's like there is this real interest in almost creating um, you know, I keep wanting to say like a visual fantasy of Blackness, because there is a way that her skin is really kind of a lot of these images, even like some of the other ones like Helmut Newton, for instance, like there's such a focus on making the skin um, almost lacquered like,
mm,
you know, like really shiny, really polished to a buff. You know, some of the images where she's almost fully nude, for instance, is like literally the skin is actually like the focus of the image.
mm.
So there is a way that I think, you know, I think most people recognize that Jean Paul did that in terms of, you know, like producing the kind of producing this like rich dark sheen with her skin, but you know, other photographers did that as well. So I think that's also part of the reason why I think in particular when people think about Grace, you know, people often think about her skin, you know, like the particular production of Blackness that is present in her skin, I think also becomes a predominant way that people visualize her in some ways. So yeah, I think there is a real way that the photographers have really influenced that perception of her.
It's
Uh,
interesting actually to sorry to
Go
cut.
ahead.
Interesting because obviously when we also think about the Helmut Newton photographs, or even like Jean-Paul Goude or others, I think the kind of like that metallic shine, or like the way her skin looks like lacquered, is like turns her into like a machine. And obviously the figure of the cyborg is like very, it's something that she played with a lot, and obviously like somehow there was like a full circle thing to me happening when she the corporate cannibal era started, where it was
Yeah.
something that she kind of like fully embodied, and at the same time was also taking some distance with, I would say. I mean, the cover of the album is just I mean, that's at the assembly line is so telling. uh,
Mhm.
I would say, but also for me was like the way they were able to play, or she played with like multiple Grace Joneses
Mhm.
uh,
Right.
in even in like live concerts
Mhm.
for the one man show. That's like so strange. I mean, I wish I had seen this live myself.
Yeah,
Uh,
because I saw her perform at the Roseland Ballroom. I guess that was it was right before I moved out of New York. So I think it was the only performance she did in the US for the Hurricane album. And I remember that one of those, I don't remember what song she was performing, but she literally brought out a clone and then danced with the clone. So, you know, I think there is a way that she really plays, like you say, with the perception of herself as some sort of like cyborg or machine, right? And I think, you know, like you said, the way that her skin was really polished, I think, and particularly with Jean Paul's work, with some of the album covers, that really lends itself to that perception of her as a kind of machine-like figure. And I think, you know, even the that commercial, the Citron CX
yeah,
commercial from
yeah.
the 80s,
Definitely.
which I like, is so even to this day, like it's just really fun to watch, because I think there is a way that there's just something really seductive about the vision of her as a kind of machine. This kind of larger than life figure that's kind of like, partly man, partly machine. But I also think it's partly, other people like, even like the Richard Bernstein photographs that were on the disco album covers, you could start to see the play with that as well. Because I think there's a way that the lighting also comes into play there, like lighting, play with surface, all that stuff comes into play with those album covers.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting because I think we often see those like those three covers and more actually as like the soft Grace Jones, but I think in the kind of like um, scholarly work that has been like established around the idea of disco or the disco era and how that's also attached to yeah reproducibility, I would say, and of like the voice and this idea of like never ending music.
Mm,
I think it's like quite interesting to actually link that up to not actually like see it as something so separate, but actually like very much yeah, and it's also interesting because the Bernstein to was using an aerograph, and somehow you could say that to apply this on the skin is a way to lacquer the skin as well. I mean, I don't know, it's quite interesting. That's not something I had like kind of thought of
yeah, because I'm
more.
just even thinking of, yeah, the techniques of the airbrushing,
Mhm.
and the way that when you see those images of her, that's when I think you really start to see this kind of the aestheticization of Grace and the way that she seems almost tailor-made for someone like Bernstein. I mean, I think those images are still to this day like incredibly interesting to kind of look at. Yes, I think, disco is interesting to think about in particular with Grace because I mean, Grace has become like the personification of disco. Like she is the person that everybody thinks of when I think of disco, and I think particularly something like Studio 54.
Mm.
Like she has become like she still remains like the main figure of that. So yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of think of those album covers in the context of that because I think we even see, I think the idea of like, recreational drug use, like all the things that we associate with disco and the way that those album covers play with that. Um, and I think even like the role of someone like Antonio Lopez too, I think like, a lot of people don't know. It's like, one of those album covers, I think it was maybe the first one, like, originally was an Antonio Lopez photograph that she was using for her modeling
Mm.
book, So I think this way that like, a lot of the things that, I think another way to say this is like, we see a lot of the way that Grace moved in between different photographers and a way that those photographers actually work together to produce these images. So even images that we think are only, made by one person actually are the product of a collaboration between different people.
Mm. Definitely, yeah. Yeah. In relation to the idea of photography and actually the one of the thing I was also trying to think of through the show was her relationship to the camera and how camera was like could be seen as a weapon as well,
Mhm,
and specifically in relation to like that has been established between like the camera and black bodies, and so I was interested in like having those tensions between images of her where she's like really facing the camera, confront in some kind of a confrontation even, and some
mhm,
others where she's like hiding or trying to like avoid the lens,
mhm,
um, and often playing with like garments,
mhm,
which is interesting when you speak about you just started to speak about Antonio Lopez, and obviously like she had like a modeling career, um, but I was very interested to like yes, see how she actually used garments to hide herself somehow. And it's kind of, or create a second skin, maybe,
Mm,
which is something that is very palpable, I think, with like Yves Saint Laurent, for instance, or Issey Miyake. And actually, the hood thing, and like
mhm,
sunglasses and like everything, she kind of like gloves and a lot of accessories that we attach to quite I think we think we've seen Grace Jones, but some of the time we actually know her kind of like completely hidden behind lots of different lots of different clothes. And that's something that is kind of, yeah, I think hopefully like present in the exhibition. Even like there is like an image of her like coming out of the Andy Warhol funerals, um,
mhm.
and she's like literally like wrapped up in clothes, and that's to me like where like the Lady Gaga thing comes,
Mhm.
which is like so interesting because when Lady Gaga started her career, that she was like using that hood. She was also using sunglasses. She was using gloves. And yeah, there is no doubt when you when you watch like the two, where you can like clear like comparisons between the two. And it's kind of interesting when you think of like such icons that they actually were trying like, to me, like somehow it could be anyone behind all of this.
Mhm.
Uh, which is yeah, very interesting to me, and something that could be problematized, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree. I mean, I think there's something really interesting because, it's funny because that's actually one of my earliest memories of her too. Like I definitely remember the very specific types of outfits that she wore in the late 80s and the 90s that were like super exaggerated, like, the oversized, like the shoulder pads, like the really fancy Miller, like the hats that she had made for herself. So I definitely think there's a way that she like performs fashion that I definitely can see other people, like Lady Gaga, like the primary example of that. But yeah, I was even thinking about, there's some photograph that Ming Smith took of her at Studio 54 where literally it's just, her like holding this long piece of fabric. Um, so yeah, I definitely think when I think of her, I definitely think of things like, like the synthetic molded bustiers, for
Yeah.
instance, like the big size sunglasses, the accessories. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a way that um, she's very comfortable with exaggerated proportions when it comes to fashion. I think, like you were saying, I think it comes from people like her work with people like, Kenzo Takada and Izzy Miyake, where she's very comfortable with almost like very avant-garde fashions,
Definitely.
but they look really natural on her. So I think about that, and I think even about, that maternity dress that Lopez and John Paul made for her. That same thing you're saying, like super exaggerated, like very cubist proportions. And there's like a practical reason she has to hide because she's trying to like, hide her pregnancy while promoting her disco album, her last one. But I think like you're saying, I mean, I've been thinking lately just about that tension between the way that you can claim her in a tradition like postmodernism in terms of these like very forward-thinking visual techniques and the like comfort, the comfort of using fashion to help do that work. But I think like you were saying on the other hand, the kind of way that it comes to Black folks and photography, that the camera also has a particular history to it. And it has not often been one that has been about producing affirming images. If anything, it's been the exact opposite of that. So I think, I've been thinking a lot about that tension lately between, the camera being liberating in terms of being able to create images of yourself, but also at the same time, Jones really tearing, I think, with how she tarries a lot with visual stereotypes of Black folks. And, you know, there's kind of like this dangerous kind of play that she does where she's able to kind of perform stereotypes, but also slip out of them at the same time. So I think that's also what makes her, I think, a really kind of complicated figure, but also like a fascinating one at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because in terms of the adjectives that we use to speak about her, I mean, when quite often when I was talking about the exhibition to some people, they were saying that she had something that was fascinating, but also a bit like scary. Some people were using that word, and I think it's kind of interesting to in relation to like her Blackness, definitely, but also the fact that she cannot be categorized or like even in relation to gender, like and at the same time something that like puts like can like make some people uncomfortable and at the same time draw them to her. And yeah, she definitely plays with that in relation. I mean, there is like that whole thing about stillness that we talked about as well beforehand that I think is like very fascinating in relation to like how Black bodies have been like kind of in the history of movement, forced to move quite often, and how stillness, the stillness that Black bodies can embody is like often threatening. I mean, it's even in relation to like when you have like I don't know what's the expression in English, but like Black people just like occupying public space and just standing where they are. That's something that makes people uncomfortable. And in relation to like live performance, I think that's something that is so interesting, the way she plays with it. And she has that I mean, she tells that story of like going to Japan for an Issey Miyake runway show, and to learning about kabuki theater and how that kind of like taught her about the power of stillness, basically, and how she could manipulate it and play with it. And when we spoke, we were mentioning the fact that that's something that to me can be found in the way Beyonce performs today. So,
yeah, I mean, I remember being really surprised when I read that because I just did not think of her performances in that context. But when she said it, and you know, her memoirs, I thought, oh, that's really interesting because you're really making it clear that a lot of your performance techniques are actually derived from Japan. And I just thought that was it made me think, it's like, you know, I think we have to kind of create this context for Grace where all of the parts that she's using are present. So like you have to talk about Japan at the same time you talk about Jamaica and you talk about Paris, you know, and there's a way that like, you know, I think that's what makes her really rich as a cultural figure, but also really unusual that she's drawing on so many distinct cultural traditions in her work. But yeah, I do think there's a way that, you know, like withdrawal and stillness as performance techniques are also particularly unusual because, like you said, like we don't think of them in relationship to Black people. Like we think of Black folks performing a kind of form of access and exteriority. And I think that's also part of the reason why people often refer to her as scary, because she does not perform the emotional expressivity that people are used to seeing, particularly with Black women. You know, there's a way that she really, she does sometimes perform a kind of almost like robotic kind of coldness, you know, and I think that it's interesting that some people find they use the word scary, but at the same time, they're also attracted to it at the same time. You know, so I think that's what's also interesting about Grace is the kind of responses that she provokes from people are often kind of contradictory. You know, but I think, like you said about occupying public space, I mean, I think there's a way that that's also what makes her a really interesting cultural figure, like somebody who was unapologetically Black, and has been unapologetically Black for so long, while also being androgynous, and almost, completely fearless and confident, even in ways that like audiences have to kind of get on board. Because as we've kind of seen, like Grace is just a figure, like she does not back down. She's not going to fade into the background. Like you're gonna have to do that before she does it.
One of the things that is like that I struggled with, in all honesty, was obviously like some of the images that were made by Jean-Paul Goude. For with her. I mean, for me, like and she says it like when she comes back to some of the kind of like difficult images of her in cages, or like with like accentuated like features that kind of Black features specifically. It's like but fall into racist tropes. I was very much like, whoa, how do I deal with this in the framework of the show? And I haven't found like the solution, to be honest. But what I kind of came to terms with was the idea of self-objectification, and how maybe that was like also like in some way like a performance strategy, to actually avoid being objectified by and othered by the gaze of someone else, basically. I don't know if like you have something to add to that, but that's
I mean, I struggled with it too, because so if I'm being really honest, there was a while where actually I didn't want to write about the John Paul images at all, because there was just a way that I feel like in a scholarship, particularly in art history, the bulk of the focus is on those images to the point where nobody really talks about anything else. And then, this past fall, for some reason, I just decided, I was like, you know what, like it's time to actually go back and think about these images and try to see if there's a way to talk about them. And when I really started thinking about it, and I like looking at what she says in her memoirs, I did think, I think there is a kind of way we could talk about them that doesn't kind of allow Jean Paul to get the last word, because I think in some ways what I see in her memoir is a real kind of reckoning with that. And I think the way that she talks about it is that she's very much aware of, she was very much aware of what she was doing, even while she was posing for those photographs. And even while I think navigating his kind of, I'd say like racist fantasies, that she still found it liberating, and she still to this day doesn't completely castigate him for those images, because she still thinks of them. There was something liberating in the kind of visual fantasy that he was making of her. And she says in many ways, he was creating what she saw in terms of herself, So I think in some ways, like, we often think of those images as, oh, this is completely Jean Paul kind of imposing his vision onto her. But the way that she frames it, it's more like, no, like they were kind of co-creators, and he was creating a visual fantasy of the way that she saw herself, in addition to the way that he saw her. I think in that way, I think we have to kind of think of her in a different way. And I think even like her performing a form of objecthood, where she is very much kind of, just because she is performing a kind of self-objectification doesn't mean that she doesn't have any agency in the matter. Like she's very much aware of what she's doing. And I think, to me, it just seems like she was really, I think if we go back to those images in the very beginning that we were talking about, like I think she liked the sense that he was creating something very distinct from the way that people thought that Black women should be visually represented. I think his vision was so different that despite, I think, what we see now as the kind of, the very like primitivist fantasies that she participates in these images, there is a way that I think it gets her closer to the artistic vision she has of herself. So I think in that way, that's the way that I kind of reconcile it. I mean, again, it's hard, but I think I still think of it as, okay, when she's participating in these visual constructions with him, I think the tension that we see is just a tension of Black photography in general and Black subjects, I think that's the way that I kind of think of it.
Yeah. I mean, I met him and he was very, very emotional, actually. I mean, he was very, very emotional, and I'm not able to kind of fully, I mean, it's difficult for me to watch those images, but at the same time, I struggle to kind of be like, that's wrong, and that should be like erased from like the whole kind of like imagery that surrounds her. But yeah, and at the same time, this, I mean, even somehow the Keith Haring paintings as well onto her body are also somehow, I mean, they are exotifying her as well. But no one, I mean, it's less often kind of like talked about. Because I guess Keith Haring, because of the figure he is today, is somehow untouchable on those issues. I mean, surely some people have been like kind of like going back to that work and the motifs and patterns that he's been using, but to paint those on like Black bodies, I think to me is like, because it was obviously, I mean, I haven't seen images of those paintings on white bodies, or maybe I'm wrong. I obviously it's like white paint and like the contrast and everything, but
I mean, I think of it as I read like Ricardo Montes recently published a book about Keith Haring, and I wanted to read the kind of, I was interested in what he would have to say about, the Haring's work with her, and I think one of the things that, he said, or what I took from that was, I was even just thinking about the way that art historian Robert Ferris Thompson was invited, I didn't know this, was invited when he was invited to watch Haring paint Jones. And that's when he comes up with this idea about, Jones is like the theory, like she is the perfect kind of body for his theory. I think there's just this way that I think with Haring, the way that Jones operates as a kind of fulcrum for white male theorization, like that's what's kind of disturbing about the Haring, because there's this way that she is seen as like the perfect vehicle for them to then project these kind of primitivist frameworks onto her. So I think like you're saying, like those images now, I mean, absolutely, there's a way that you actually, we can see that very clearly. But I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a way that because of the kind of figure that Haring is now, there's a way that people don't want to completely castigate him for that. But I do think there's this way that, the kind of way that she is seen by him as a perfect personification of pop and primitivism at the same time, it's problematic for sure. I just think and I think again, it goes into the way, it's very reflective of the way that these particular people viewed Blackness. That's the thing that, I kind of see when I think about these images.
Yeah. Talking about self-objectification, I think one of the interesting figure that come into place as well was Adrian Piper, in relation to her own experience with like clubs and disco, and you actually also researched Adrian Piper, and I was like, what? That's like such an interesting kind of like bridge to make. I thought I was like, yeah, no one is never gonna be like linking Grace Jones and Adrian Piper, but actually you kind of also, she's also part of the female performers and artists that are surrounding you. If you want. talk about her a little.
Yeah, I think even when I was writing the book, because like Grace wasn't in the book, but there was a point afterwards when I started thinking about her that I remember thinking to myself, oh, it's really interesting to think about the two of them together because they were in New York at the same time. And they were going to these nightclubs, but they just weren't going to the same clubs per se. It's like, Studio 54, and Enchanted Gardens, for instance, in Queens, were the places that Jones really went. I think also obviously places like, Paradise Garage, for instance. Whereas, Piper, like Max's Kansas City was like her main place. But I think even like, Entre Nous when she was a go-go dancer initially. And I think, I love that writing that Piper does about being a go-go dancer and being inside the cage and dancing in the cage. And like, I just love that she's literally talking about that space, but then she does this thing that's it's such a philosophical discussion about what it means to perform self-objectification. And I think that's what's really interesting to kind of think about, her theorizing that and doing it so early too. I mean, like doing it in the 70s. So that's, I think, one way to kind of think of them together, because I have been thinking about the way that a lot of these figures write about the space of disco and the kind of love that they really have for it. I mean, if you think about Jones's memoirs, I mean, the way that she writes about a lot of these spaces, like she still has a lot of affection for them. So I definitely think there's a way that, I think of the two of them together. And yeah, even with Piper, just thinking about, her all of a sudden deciding in the early 80s that, she's going to do the funk lessons performances and like, teach people how to dance to funk music while also at the same time lecturing them about the origins of funk music. So yeah, I just think that there's a way that I think we don't think about that enough. I've just been thinking about the nightclub as like a form of pedagogy. Like you're teaching people how to become versions of themselves that the disco kind of enables. And I think, we see that over and over again, but even the way that Jones talks about her own relationship to disco. And I think even things like, LSD, as a way of her becoming a kind of better, more enhanced version of herself.
It's so good to hear because it's exactly the kind of like, connections I was trying to make. So for Adrian Piper, there is that kind of recording of that performance piece where she's speaking about herself in like a club environment and disco and self-objectification, but also those first kind of drawings executed under LSD. Basically. So yeah, I mean, it's good to hear. It's good to hear.
Well, I think even now, especially too, because what's also been interesting to me is, so I didn't know anything about the whole history of LSD. And it's only, I think, been recently because people, I think Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind helped facilitate this, but I think there's actually, I've just been noticing recently that there's been a lot of interest in LSD now, and then people are looking at it differently than they used to. And I started thinking about that also in the context of Grace, because, when I was reading her memoirs, I was really struck by when she talks about LSD. And I thought, oh, like I didn't know that LSD was such a huge influence over her, but the way that she discusses it, it was. So I just was, thinking about that. And that's what really made me think. It's like, oh, wow, recreational drug use really did a lot of work, but not the way that we typically think about it. It's like, oh, like, people were just taking all these drugs and partying at Studio 54. It's like, no, like people were taking these drugs, but for some people, they really facilitated freedom. Like LSD actually, I think particularly for like a Black woman like Grace Jones, like it actually helped her become the Grace Jones that we now know. It helped her like get rid of a lot of the influence of growing up as a Pentecostal, for instance.
I think we kind of touched upon all of the points. I'm looking at the list of subjects we wanted to kind of and issues we wanted to kind of talk about. And surely there is like much more to say, and like I think we focused a lot on the image, and we haven't spoken about the sound, although that's something that could have also been kind of like analyzed and talked about parallelly, because it's kind of interesting to see how the two intersect or not, actually. But yeah, thank you so much for that conversation, which at the same time comforted me in like the things, the intuitions I had, and like the same time made me think of new possibilities and connections to make. So
Yeah. Because I even think about, when we think about, you know, going off of what you just said, even yeah, like thinking about the images, the visual and the music actually intersecting when it comes to Jones. Like in a lot of ways, like you have to talk about both of them simultaneously in some of these images, because the images themselves are kind of loud. So I think even that is like, you know, really interesting to think about in relationship to her work.
that's for another talk, I guess. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I don't know if there is like, are you planning on publishing anything anytime soon, focusing on Grace or else, or?
I think so. Like I'm still trying to think about who. I've been thinking about Pat Cleveland lately too. Because I definitely, when I've been, you know, building this archive, she just keeps popping up in it. So I've also been potentially thinking about adding her into the mix. But yeah, you know, I'm just finishing up some of the work, and yeah, I'm hoping it's going to come out in the next couple of years for sure.
No, we
Fingers crossed.
yeah. We'll be on the lookout for that for sure. Well, thank you so much, and to everyone who is watching, stay tuned.